I'll introduce the next panelists, and then we'll go in order, and then we will have a large discussion about everything. Jordan Johansen is Assistant Professor of Classics in the Department of World Languages and Cultures at the University of Utah. She earned her PhD from the University of Chicago and has published essays on ancient necromancy, spells, and other documents related to classical magic. Her current project is on border ecologies, the Nubian-Egyptian border in the cross-cultural imaginary, 5th century BCE to 4th century CE. Annie Greene is Assistant Professor of Modern Middle Eastern History at the University of Utah. Her scholarship focuses on late 19th and early 20th century cultural and intellectual production in the Ottoman Arab provinces and in Iraq in particular. She has published essays on Ottoman history, and her current project examines multilingual press networks, neoclassical poetry, and Ottoman civic participation as part of the Nakba in Iraq. Liron Moore is Associate Professor of Comparative Literature at the University of California, Irvine. She earned her PhD from Cornell and has published a book, Conflicts, the Poetics and Politics of Palestine-Israel, as well as essays on modern Hebrew and Arabic literature, critical theory, legal theory, and visual studies. Her current project interrogates intentionality as a mechanism for racializing both Mizrahi Jews and Palestinians. Rawad Wehbe is newly appointed Assistant Professor of Arabic. Congratulations, Rawad. Rawad is just appointed Assistant Professor in the Department of World Languages and Cultures at the University of Utah. He earned his PhD from the University of Pennsylvania and has translated a volume of Safaz Fathi's poetry, as well as numerous other contemporary Arab poets. His current project explores early Islamic poetry in Arabic at the intersection of emotion, form, and time. Jordan?
So I want to reiterate my thanks to Scott and Beth for organizing this great symposium and the great talk by David Dermash today and yesterday, and the other great panelists. So on August 24th, 394 CE, an Egyptian priest named Nesmet-Errakem carved an inscription honoring the Nubian god Mandulus into a temple on the island of Philae at Egypt's southern border. This marks the last known readable example of Egyptian hieroglyphs from antiquity. A few years earlier, Roman Emperor Theodosius I had ordered the closure of all pagan temples of Egypt. Philae, just beyond the empire's southern border, became the last stronghold of Egyptian religion and a final repository of sacred cultural knowledge. Nesmet-Errakem marks this persistence by carving a sacred image accompanied by a text in two native Egyptian scripts. So here in hieroglyphs and down here in Demotic. In the inscription, the priest expresses a hope that his sacred words would endure for all time and eternity. Within a generation, no one remained who could read the hieroglyphic script, but its symbolic power endured. Even unreadable, hieroglyphs remained a sacred sign system rich in cultural and symbolic afterlives. Today, I'll explore the transformation of Egyptian hieroglyphs from a readable script to a symbolic one. The hieroglyphic texts I'll discuss today were not necessarily meant to be read, but to be seen and felt as symbols of mysticism, power, and cultural capital. My central claim is that hieroglyphs became a powerful, trans-historical symbolic script world, less about what they said and more about what they meant to people who couldn't read them. This symbolic function changed over time through processes of colonial adoption, reinterpretation, and esoteric appropriation. My talk focuses on four key cultural collisions that reshaped hieroglyphs: Ptolemaic imperialism, Roman imperialism, Renaissance Hermeticism, and American Revelation, which we saw a little bit from Professor Demmer's talk yesterday. I'll touch briefly on each to sketch a picture of how hieroglyphs lived on as a symbolic script world. But first, a quick overview. What are Egyptian hieroglyphs? So on this side, you'll see the 6 major scripts used in ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs, or ancient Egypt. So we have the hieroglyphs up here. We have Demotic, Hieratic, Coptic, and of course Latin, and Greek down here, which came a bit later. And the oldest hieroglyphs was continuously used for 3,500 years. And this coexistence of scripts isn't just linguistic, it's symbolic of Egypt's layered, often contested cultural identity. Egyptian hieroglyphs blend ideographic, logographic, syllabic, and alphabetic elements using a core of around 700 to 800 signs. Many look like people, animals, stars, tools, and things you can see on the image and can kind of look for them there. To the ancient Egyptians, writing was a divine gift. They called hieroglyphs medu'u neche, God's words. And our English term hieroglyph comes from the Greek hieroglyphikos, meaning sacred carving. Hieroglyphs were primarily used on monuments, royal decrees, temple inscriptions, autobiographies, and tombs and funerary texts. And because of their sacred associations, Greco-Roman writers imagined hieroglyphs as an allegorical or even a magical system, one that encoded secret mystical truths. The Latin author Apuleius called the script literae ignorabilis, or unknown characters. But in reality, the script was complex but completely rational. So what happens when a script like this, so deeply tied to divine authority and cultural identity, collides with empire? The first collision I want to explore is the Ptolemaic imperialism, the moment when Greek rulers take over Egypt, but they don't erase hieroglyphs. Instead, they absorb, adapt, and transform them in powerful symbolic ways. So my first example is the Rosetta Stone, a monumental stele famous for unlocking the translation of hieroglyphs, but equally important as a symbol of cultural negotiations. Carved in 196 BCE, it records a priestly decree issued in honor of a Ptolemaic king. Like other decrees of this period, the Rosetta Stone presents the same text in 3 scripts. So you have hieroglyphs at the top, Demotic down here, and in the middle, and then Greek at the bottom. And these weren't just translations, they were targeted communications. Hieroglyphs served the gods and the priesthood, Demotic addressed the Egyptian-speaking populace, and Greek spoke to the ruling elite. The Rosetta Stone isn't just a multilingual text, it's a performance of power staged in stone. The Rosetta Stone exemplifies the Ptolemaic strategy of symbolic multilingualism, a deliberate use of script to negotiate power. The hieroglyphic version wasn't just ornamental, it functioned as a visual claim to divine legitimacy. By inscribing their decrees in the sacred script of the pharaohs, Greco-Macedonian rulers positioned themselves as heirs to Egypt's religious authority. The fusion of language and scripts reflects a broader cultural collision, Greek imperial power overlaying but not erasing Egypt's sacred traditions. The stone becomes more than a decree. It's a stage where competing systems, imperial, religious, and linguistic, perform their coexistence. And the Rosetta Stone shows how hieroglyphs function as sacred symbols of continuity. But under the Ptolemies, this sacred writing system wasn't just preserved, it was transformed. At temples like Edfu, Philae, and Dendera, inscriptions adopted intentionally obscure cryptographic hieroglyphs to encode divine knowledge. These texts, filled with rare signs, puns, and layered meanings, often baffle modern scholars. The Ptolemaic system saw a dramatic increase in signs from, again, 700 to 800 to over 2,000. At first, we thought it was 7,000, but we've brought the number down. Often with a single sign having 20 or more phonetic values. And this wasn't just obfuscation, it was a theological virtuosity, amplifying sacred knowledge and showcasing priestly authority. Take the hymn of the ram god Khnum Ra here from the Temple of Esna. Though it may appear as a repetition of ram glyphs, you just have ram, ram, ram, ram, ram, ram, ram, all the way down and back up. Subtle variations in crown and posture reveal theological wordplay and scribal creativity. And it takes a really very basic text, theological text, and transforms it into a dazzling display of sacred art and an intellectual performance of divine literacy. And there's another one on the other side that's all crocodiles all the way down. So this sacred scribal performance, dense with meaning and mastery, marked the height of hieroglyphic creativity, but it was also kind of a swan song. In 30 BCE, Egypt became a Roman province, and with Roman conquest came a new wave of cultural appropriation. The Romans, fascinated by Egypt's religious authority and antiquity, began to collect and repurpose Egyptian monuments, especially obelisks, But unlike the Egyptian priests, the Romans weren't interested in understanding what the hieroglyphs said. They were interested in what they meant, as symbols of ancient wisdom, divine power, and imperial legitimacy. And our next collision looks at how the Romans used Egyptian hieroglyphs not to preserve knowledge, but to project their own power. So in 30 BCE, after Cleopatra's suicide and the fall of Ptolemaic Egypt, Octavian, soon to be Augustus, annexed Egypt as a Roman province. To commemorate his victory, he had pharaonic obelisks shipped to Rome as imperial trophies. One of these, the Flaminian obelisk shown here, was originally inscribed with praises for the pharaohs Seti and Ramses II from the New Kingdom. And while its hieroglyphs were unreadable to Romans, they carried a symbolic weight. And Augustus added a Latin inscription proclaiming the obelisk as a gift to the sun, marking Egypt's submission to Rome. This reflects some awareness of the obelisk's original meaning, and this one in particular stood at the temple of Ra in Heliopolis, sacred to the Egyptian sun god. And then there's also a Greek translation of the hieroglyphic text, which was recorded by a 4th century CE Roman historian, focused on Greco-Roman sun god Apollo, Augustus's divine patron, rather than the original text. And interestingly, the historian writes in Latin, but he preserves this in Greek. And translators are always like, what do we do? How do we translate to make sure everyone knows this is in Greek? This shifted the obelisk from a symbol of Egypt's glory to one of imperial power, legitimizing Augustus as a divinely sanctioned ruler at the dawn of the Roman Empire. Roman fascination with hieroglyphs persisted. Emperors collected Egyptian obelisks and even created their own, featuring copied, invented, or fake hieroglyphs, so-called pseudo-hieroglyphs. Emperor Aurelius, for example, commissioned a replica of the Flaminian obelisk, but the hieroglyphs were copied with errors, some even upside down. It had like toppled over a bit, and so they were trying to carve it as a copy, but upside down. And this reflected how hieroglyphs, divorced from their original meaning, had become an aestheticized echo of Egyptian power. The Pamphili obelisk shown here, commissioned by Emperor Domitian, featured new inscriptions in Middle Egyptian, a classical, already archaic form that lent prestige and pharaonic legitimacy. Though unreadable to most Romans, the script carried symbolic weight, associating Domitian with Egypt's divine kingship and sacred knowledge, and at this point, also with Augustus. The inscription, likely based on a Greek draft, was carved by Egyptian priests in Rome. Its awkward, elongated signs suggest local craftsmanship. After Domitian's assassination, the Senate issued a damnatio memoriae to erase him from history. His name vanished from Latin and Greek records, but his name survived in hieroglyphs on these obelisks. Protected in royal cartouches, the script shielded his memory from erasure. Egyptian writing, once appropriated for imperial grandeur, became a vessel of defiance against Roman censorship. Some Roman obelisks featured pseudo-hieroglyphs, scripts that mimicked Egyptian writing but carried no linguistic meaning. These were truly the literae ignorabiles, the unknown characters of Apuleius. Their power lay not in what they said, we don't know what they said, but in how they looked, exotic, arcane, and divine. Some, like the Florence obelisk on the slide, imitated real signs with varying success. Others abandoned accuracy altogether, indulging in aesthetic fantasy. And I'll tell you a little story. I was doing an archaeological dig in Cyprus. I found a little scarab. I was very excited. On the back had hieroglyphs. I was like, oh, I can finally use all these years of taking hieroglyphs. It was nonsense. It was very upsetting. I was like, this is so sad. In ancient Rome, hieroglyphs were not used to convey language. Instead, they functioned as visual symbols of religious authority and religious and imperial authority. Their unreadability became part of their power, setting the stage for later European fascination with hieroglyphs as mysterious, sacred signs. And until now, we've looked at hieroglyphs as sites of imperial and cultural collisions, how they were used to assert authority and stage power across Egypt and Rome. But after the script fell out of everyday use, a different kind of collision emerged, an epistemic one. When no one could read hieroglyphs anymore, people didn't stop interpreting them. They transformed them into symbols of mystery and power, constructing entirely new frameworks for what hieroglyphs were for. Were they magical symbols, divine signs, hidden allegories? And this next section traces how hieroglyphs transform from a written language into a symbolic system of thought, what we might call, again, a symbolic script world. During the Renaissance, hieroglyphs fascinated scholars, reaching its height with Athanasius Kircher, a 17th century Jesuit polymath, who believed that Egyptian hieroglyphs encoded sacred universal truths. In works like Oedipus Aegyptiacus in 1652 to 1655, Kircher wasn't interested in only translating Egyptian as a language, but he also sought to unlock the divine wisdom he believed its symbols concealed. The frontispiece of this work, which is you can see here on the slide, shows Kircher as an Oedipus solving the riddle of the very Egyptian Sphinx here, a visual metaphor for his interpretive ambitions with hieroglyphs. The hieroglyphs to Kircher were not phonetic, but symbolic, a spiritual rebus pointing to hidden cosmological and theological truths. And one of his most important sources was the Mensa Isiaka. And you can see why he might have liked it. There's all these pictures, and it's supposed to be each of the gods, and they were supposed to have labels on each of the gods. Well, unfortunately, this Roman artifact is covered in pseudo-hieroglyphs. It never was real hieroglyphs. And he spends most of his book, the huge portion of his book, making a grammar based on this text. So he mistakenly thinks it's real Egyptian hieroglyphs. And he uses all of his linguistic knowledge of Greek, Hebrew, Coptic, and of course his own symbolic ideas. And he reads these hieroglyphs using it as a spiritual cipher. And like the Roman pseudo-hieroglyphs, Kircher's readings weren't translations. Of course, there's really no text here, but they were certainly imaginative reinventions. The Pamphili obelisk returns here in a different light. Earlier, we saw it as an imperial display by the Emperor Domitian. Remember, his name survives on that. But in 1650, Athanasius Kircher turned to the same obelisk, and he turns it into a cytosymbolic interpretation. And he writes a book called Obeliscus Pamphilius. And Kircher treated its hieroglyphs not as, again, a phonetic script, but as a mystical text revealing divine truths. His reading was very poetic and completely disconnected from the actual inscription. And the difference is really stark. So this is a modern translation of what the line that he's translating is, says, Horus, strong bull, beloved of Ma'at. And this is how Kircher translates that exact same line. So the triform, I'm not going to read the whole thing. I mean, he just goes on and on and on and on. He has the world of genies, one of the guardian of the ruler. It's poetic. Ironically, unfortunate, I don't know. It is Kircher's, this one, imaginative misreading, not an accurate translation that is carved into the base of the obelisk, which can still be seen in Rome today. But Kircher's symbolic script world was already under pressure. Enlightenment thinkers like Descartes dismissed him as a charlatan. One writer says that his book was a monstrosity. It really is. Kircher's failure marks a turning point, a collision between Renaissance mysticism and Enlightenment rationalism, between script as mystery and script as a decipherable code. Okay, we'll have one last short collision, the American Revelation. So just as Kircher read divine truths into hieroglyphs, Joseph Smith too engaged with Egyptian script, not as a linguistic system, but as a medium of revelation. Though there is no direct lineage from Kircher to Smith, the logic of symbolic script worlds persists. Smith, like earlier figures, viewed hieroglyphs not merely as readable text, but as a conduit to divine knowledge and spiritual revelation. This conceptualization of hieroglyphs reflects a broader trend in the history of script, where the unreadable becomes a tool for mystical and symbolic interpretation rather than literal translation. Joseph Smith's translation of the Book of Abraham exemplifies a modern iteration of the symbolic script world. While Smith did not possess a scholarly understanding of Egyptian, he described his translation as divinely inspired, achieved by the gift and power of God. Echoing earlier figures like Kircher, Smith treated hieroglyphs as sacred symbols infused with spiritual meaning. Working with his associates, Smith produced the Kirtland Egyptian Papers, a collection of manuscripts that includes the grammar and alphabet of the Egyptian language, an attempt to systematize the characters alongside speculative meanings. It's really just a reverse grammar based on his translation of the Book of Abraham. Though these efforts reflect a desire to understand the script, the process was not linguistic in a modern sense. Instead, meaning was revealed through inspiration, not translation. Seer stones, you can see here, and spiritual vision played a central role, turning unreadable characters into conduits for divine revelation. So when script worlds collide, as we see with hieroglyphs, meaning transcends readability. Once a functional script, hieroglyphs evolved into symbols of mystique, power, and sacred authority. From ancient Egypt to Joseph Smith's divine translation to modern graffiti like Egyptian Redim on the streets of Chicago, hieroglyphs have persisted not through legibility, but through symbolic force. In every collision, whether in Egypt, Rome, or America, they become emblems of authority and imagination. Though untranslated for centuries, hieroglyphs have never been silent. They live on as dynamic, ever-changing script world, speaking in symbol, myth, and vision, and reinvented with each new encounter. Thank you very much.
All right, I also would like to thank Scott and Beth and everyone else who's presented today. I'm going to be talking about, well, there have been a lot of language reforms and a lot of script reforms, and we know that because they've succeeded. So I'm going to talk about one that failed. And so this is the new script, al-khatt al-jadid, and why this is something that helps us think about modernity. So even before the Turkish language reforms of the 20th century that Jeffrey Lewis calls the catastrophic success that David Jarmusch mentioned yesterday, wherein Mustafa Kemal Atatürk forcibly moved Turkish from the Perso-Arabic script to the Latinate script, there were also proposed script reforms in the Middle East that did not occur. And so I'm proposing to talk about today how to get a full scope of the language wars, it is necessary to consider plans that were implemented as well as those that were not. The case I share today is that of the new Arabic script that Ottoman Iraqi intellectual Jamil Sidqi Zahawi, shown here, invented at the end of the 19th century. His script reform was a complete failure. The Arabic script has remained, but the script reform that Zahawi invented generated a lot of discussion in newspapers at the time, in both Arabic and in Ottoman Turkish. Instead of ruminating over his failure, I think it is more instructive to discuss why he thought there needed to be a new Arabic script specifically at that point in time, and why this script reform was coming from Iraq. Writing about language was of interest to Arab intellectuals, particularly writing about the Arabic language. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the Arabic language was understood as a container for Arab history, culture, civilization, literature, as well as something that could be stretched into the future. This project about language was part of the Nahdha, translated as the Arab Renaissance, the movement of reviving classical Arabic knowledge and culture, all the while classifying and creating new knowledge and culture in Arabic, similar to both the intellectual efforts of the European Renaissance and the European Enlightenment, but in Arabic. The Arab Renaissance was generated by Arab intellectuals living in the Ottoman Empire and was carried into the interwar years. Yet, for most of its duration, this Arab cultural project was Ottoman in its political reality. There were two simultaneous linguistic trends amongst the Ottoman Empire's reformist intellectuals. The first trend was the access to complex, sophisticated language. The second trend was the access to common language, which resulted in vulgarization. I understand common here in both senses, a common uniting language and a language for the common person. These simultaneous trends reinforced diglossia, two varieties of the same language used under different conditions within a community, often by the same individuals. In the late 19th century, both Ottoman Turkish and Arabic went through a modernization of terms and a reckoning with diglossia. Thus, in Ottoman Iraq, which is here, the other dot is the imperial capital, Istanbul. So thus, in Ottoman Iraq in particular, and in all of the Arab provinces in general, Ottoman subjects were exposed to two different kinds of diglossias: a popular Turkish, a literary administrative Ottoman Turkish, the language of state, a colloquial regional specific Arabic, Amiya, and a literary standard Arabic, Fusha. intellectuals responded to this plurilingual monoscripturalism in different ways. Jamil Sidqi Zahawi was a public intellectual from Baghdad. He was of Kurdish heritage, received traditional education in the Islamic sciences, in classical Arabic and Persian literatures, and he was also fluent in Ottoman Turkish. This training was representative of elite Ottoman education for young Sunni Muslim men, and it indicates the multilingualism of the Ottoman eastern frontier, because the neighboring empire is Iran. Over the course of Az-Zahawi's lifetime, he was elected as a member of parliament for Baghdad. He would publish several treatises, including an anti-Wehhabi text that made him very unpopular in Arabia and also very much concerned the Ottoman Sultan. He published a book where he invented a new theory of gravity that is scientifically incorrect. He wrote philosophical and linguistic essays published in the most prominent of Arabic newspapers of the time, which are in Cairo and Beirut. And he composed Arabic poetry in the neoclassical style, becoming one of the most famous Iraqi poets of the early 20th century. I'm sure his parents were very proud. In 1895, Az-Zahawi wrote a pamphlet that proposed a new script, al-khatt jadid, for Arabic. And under the influence, and this pamphlet was stirred up quite a kerfuffle, and this pamphlet was sent to Istanbul, and as a result, he began to be surveilled by the Ottoman government. The Ottoman Turkish newspaper, İkdam, published about his invention, as well as and the confusion and consternation that arose in the capital as a result. Al-Muqtataf, a very prestigious scientific and cultural magazine in Cairo, began to report on Az-Zahawi's new script in Arabic, referring to the articles in İkdam first. So we have a translation from Ottoman Turkish into Arabic. We have a translation from the provinces to the imperial capital and then to the cultural capital of Cairo. And the hullabaloo about this proposed script grew. So Az-Zahawi got into even more trouble. It is only at the end of 1896 that Az-Zahawi himself was invited to clarify the situation, an attempt to quell concerns by submitting his own essay to this newspaper. Unlike many of the other script reforms of the 19th and 20th centuries, Az-Zahawi does not suggest that Arabic borrow another existing script, as in the case of 20th century Turkish or Uzbek. He proposes an entirely new script, which he invented and took him 6 years. So this is the script that Az-Zahawi invents. And this is, I have copied, so we're going to look at a few more slides. So I've taken these from the newspaper Al-Muqtataf. So each letter, harf, gets a new corresponding letter. And so there are lots of rules about the connections before and after letters in Arabic, and some are isolated, which means, as Zahawi talks about, that when these letters are printed in the printing press, you need so many more of the individual typefaces. So Az-Zahawi is then counting how many of the letters would be required to print. Not so with his new script. So there are many fewer letters that are now required. He also, here, fatha, dhamma, qasra, these are the internal vowels. So right before, so we have long vowels and short vowels in Arabic. The long vowels are individual letters. The short vowels would be markings that are sometimes shown only if there would be confusion. And so these internal markings, these internal vowels, short vowels, have markings, but they're going to be grafted into these new iron foundries for these letters. And so this is, and so these harakat, these internal vowels, would also be created with new letters. So even though they're going to be more letters, there are still fewer of them than all of the individual letters that need to be created because of the initial, medial, and final positions. So Zahawi is saying still there are fewer of these than what we already have. This is better. He also says that with this new script, it can be read from, these letters can be read from right to left and left to right. And so what this is doing is he's trying to clamp down on the fact that already in newspapers, and I'll show you some examples in a minute, like al-khatt, this very prestigious cultural and scientific review that was printed in Cairo and Beirut, we have multi-scripturalism. And so we'll have the presence of, when foreign words from English and French are printed, they are not transliterated, not always. They will be printed in French or English, and also in Arabic. And so this can be off-putting to those who might not know how to read them. So the ability to print this script in right to left and left to right means that this is a script for the people of the East that, as he says, but also can contain the scripts of the West. So it can go in both directions. He also creates new characters for letters that are not part of Arabic, but are part of the languages that are part of the Perso-Arabic script, Arabic adjacent, Persian, Turkish, and Kurdish. And so here we have the pe, the che, the je, the ing, an emphatic la, and the qa, and so, or va. And so he creates these extra letters, again, that can adopt for, so we can have Persian, we can have Kurdish, we can have Ottoman Turkish altogether and not have to adapt other letters, and also can work with these foreign scripts as well. And he invents, again, new characters for the numbers. And he has lots of ideas about 10, which he discusses. He's not sure. This goes to aesthetics, actually. And so with these ideas, he is adamant that this is very easy to teach and learn. It'll only take a day or two, yawma yawmain. It is very easy to write and print, which we will come back to. And the letters can convey any Western or Eastern language. And since the vocalization is bound up in the letter, one does not need to know the depths of grammar, morphology, and syntax, thereby closing the gap between Fusha and Amiya, thereby closing the gap between those who would have their colloquial dialects and the standard literary language. He gives several different examples of so this top line is without the internal voweling. And then this middle line is now we have the internal voweling, so we can see how these would be pronounced. And as I'll say, his biggest argument is that you can only know how to read a word in Arabic if you already know how to read the word in Arabic. And so this is a problem. And then the bottom line, he's showing what it will look like with poetry, which also has, again, some other vowelings. And so he's showing what that would look like, the tanweens. So he has two main objectives with this invention. The first is to find a practical alternative to a script that he believes was neither well suited for printing nor well suited for conveying the other languages of the Ottoman Empire, such as Turkish, Persian, or Kurdish. The second objective that I claim is to find and define the language of modernity in print. As for the first objective, his reasoning is based on the full vocalization that reading Arabic properly requires. As I said, these printing presses are not capable of doing so at the time. Printed Arabic words did not carry all of the internal vowels, and vowel markings were only shown in instances to prevent confusion. And indeed, this practice is still largely adhered to today. As such, readers already have to know what the word is. As Zahawi gives examples from esteemed newspapers and books that misplace the hamza, this letter, and the seat and the letter seat on which it would be rest. And so these are esteemed newspapers and books that are printing the hamza wrong or eliding it, which would lead to confusion. And so these words would be read wrong. With regards to vowels, as Zahawi points out, that the Arabic script does not accommodate the voweling structures of other languages and offers two Turkish words with Arabic vowel equivalents as examples, such as the waw in bozar and the ya in eder. So reading this phonetically in Arabic, we would read as bozar. And reading this phonetically in Arabic, we'd read eider. But this is bozar and eder in Turkish. So he's saying that if you're an Arabic reader reading these Turkish words, you'll read them wrong. So we have a problem. And so as such, one may conclude that he takes no issue sharing a script world with Turkish, Persian, and Kurdish. However, what he's arguing is that the shared script itself is deficient, which he says over and over. The specific claim about script is going to be raised by Ataturk in 1928 to change Turkish to the Latinate script. Although Greek and Armenian would be better, but there are reasons, political reasons, violent reasons, that those aren't going to be possible. That the Perso-Arabic script, having only 3 vowels, is insufficient in conveying the 8 vowels of Turkish. As for the second objective, the quest for modern language, this search seems to be based in the rigid division between Amiya and Fusha, between the colloquial language and the literary language. In Khatt al-Jadid, Zahawi makes clear that the distinction between the literate elites and the common people who speak Amiya and do not read or write. The latter, he says, don't have books. He suggests that if Fusha were to be bestowed upon them or imposed upon them, the script would need to be changed to be one that is more widespread. By forging a new script and teaching it to members of the general population, in addition to the already educated elite, who can recognize the words when they see them, otherwise preserved by the old script. This reforming effort, connecting language, a new script, and the civic practices of people coalesce around Zahawi's attempts to find the language of modernity. Though he concedes it's not completely a new idea. The Italians and the Greeks took their ancient languages and made them universally accessible to the public at large. Zahawi foresaw opposition to his proposal, and he prepared counter-arguments. To his religious opponents, who asserted Arabic is the language of the glorious Quran, Zahawi remarks, the Quran was written in the Kufic script, and the script of the age of the Jahiliyyah and the idolaters. And then it was written in the Naskh script, without generating debate or outrage from amongst the religious scholars. So this argument is one of calligraphic difference, or font change. To those who guarded against the alteration of God's word, they had to concede this evidence that scripts had changed. So Zahawi still makes it clear that Quranic studies will be continued to be conducted in what he calls the old script of Arabic. This case is of a language anxiety within the same multilingual script world, and the solutions proposed. Yet why propose a new script at the end of the 19th century? And why is it more likely that we would observe something like this from Iraq? So I have 2 quick thoughts to wrap up. Thinking about material culture and technology helps us answer the first question, especially when reading his essay closely. He does not only say that he wants a new script to write in, kiteba. He wants a new script to print in, tiba. So this proposal for a new script is inherently tied with modern printing technology. So even though the printing press was an early modern invention, he's thinking about it with regards to the 19th century. Movable type printing presses come to the Middle East. Soon after they're invented, people begin printing away in the Ottoman Empire, in the Ottoman capital of Istanbul. But what languages and scripts are they printing in? Ladino in the Hebrew script, Greek and Armenian. Printing in the Perso-Arabic script is not going to become more acceptable and more widespread until the 18th century. And even then, manuscript culture, of course, continues to run side by side as elsewhere. The quality of a printed book, the paper, the binding from the 18th century and earlier is better than in the mass production of the 19th century. That's largely why I, as a 19th century historian, am holding my recent documents more gingerly than colleagues who are working on early modern period. Your books are better. I'm jealous. And in the lithographic printed works, essentially printed manuscripts and handwritten books, there are more fully vocalizations that are written in. And that adds to the beauty of the calligraphy, but also the ease of reading. So Zahawi's New Arabic Script is a language anxiety response to the mass market printing of Arabic, which is picking up more in the mid-19th century, something that was newer in technology and was being more rapidly adapted by the Perso-Arabic script. Errors in grammar, spelling, and morphology were rife, but there was nothing more in character for an intellectual of the Arab Renaissance than to publicly point out someone else's mistakes in rhymed prose. Why would a new script be more likely to be found in Iraq? As I argue in my book, the frontier intellectuals of Iraq were geographically removed from the cultural dominance of the Eastern Mediterranean and the orientation toward the West. A plurilingual and a multi-scriptural space, Iraqis engaged Arabic, Hebrew, Armenian, Syriac, and Aramaic, Hindustani, Kurdish, Persian, and Turkish. There was a greater reception to collecting all of the different dialects and religiolects and writing them down, preserving them as Iraqi culture, recognizing the ancient Akkadian roots in the colloquial, Shako Mako, asking what's up and what's there, claiming that just as Fusha preserves Amiya, it works the other way around too. Jamisuke Zahawi proposed a new script to be a common language of writing and typing, a common language of the East, one that translated the foreign words into the same script. Monoscripturalism would ease the adaptation of neologisms, bridge dialects, and reject projections of imperial and global power. So as we know, the script reform was not taken up. The editors of al-khatt here thank him for his effort, but assure their readers in a rather tongue-in-cheek way, there's not going to be a change in script. Let's just marvel at this intellectual exercise coming out of Baghdad and effectively end this kerfuffle in the press. However, just because the script reform was not adopted, that should not consign it to the dustbin of history. Perhaps these successful catastrophes can teach us about the relationships between the intellectual elites and common people, whom they idealized in their language projects of national, imperial, and utopian nature. From these failures, we might learn more about the histories and experiences of diglossia, plurilingualism, and multiscripturalism in practice, since Zahawi was driven to standardize a script to be a container of knowledge for the people of the East. And with my own research agenda on the Arab Renaissance in Iraq, and why this has been ignored until now, why I assert we need a new model for studying the Arab Renaissance, I propose it largely has to do with multiple languages intersecting. As such, I claim that writing about the Arab language in languages and scripts different from Standard Arabic should still be contributions to the project of the Arab Renaissance. So therefore, this failed script project, even if it had succeeded, is a part of the Nahda. Lastly, since this case comes at the beginning of the era of the one nation, one language, one modernity model, we can interrogate the modern anxieties that script and technology were causing along the ladder of progress and advancement. Thank you.
So I want to start by thanking Beth and Scott for organizing this. It's an honor to be here, and I should start by mentioning the title of my talk because it's not on the screen. I titled it "Scripting Disappearance, Erasure as Conflict in Palestine-Israel," and I should have gone with Erasure as War Making to be even more precise. So I want to apologize that with everything that is currently going on, I went a bit off script. Sorry for the pun. And because I found it difficult to not talk about what is happening, and also because my own work is on conflict. So I'm leaning a bit away from the Scriptworlds topic and more towards the collision part of the title of the symposium. And I hope that you forgive me. So as I mentioned, I'm going to talk about disappearance and erasure. And I want to see how disappearance and erasure operate in this conflict, or how they become a way of sustaining war, and even a mode of doing war. And I'm going to start with Gaza and try to connect what is happening right now to a chapter of my book that is about disappearance and erasure. And hopefully at the very end, I will get to what Professor Damrosch was talking about. If you remember that image of the erased Arabic place names, that's the itinerary. That's where I want to end. So I don't know if you've noticed, but Israel's all-out assault on Gaza and Hamas's horrific October 7th attack are some of the most documented violent events in history. Billions of viewers globally were and still are intimately exposed to images of spectacular violence and everyday devastation. In the case of Gaza, the scale alone is unparalleled. The cumulative weight of the bombs that Israel has dropped on Gaza in the past 18 months is greater than the weight of bombs dropped by the US and its allies in Iraq in 8 years of war. You might have known that already. Correspondingly, the scale of death, maiming, and destruction is similarly unprecedented. So beyond these pretty horrifying facts, what is also unprecedented is not just the scale of the ensuing suffering, mortalities, morbidities, starvation, and deprivation, but also the availability of all of that to our gaze. Never before were we so intimately exposed to these kinds of images. And this availability is, as always, mediated. If in the past, outsiders' exposure to such violence was mediated and also often censored by international officials and by what is now called legacy media, just newspapers, journalists. Nowadays, as Israel bars foreign correspondents and investigators from entering the Strip, the violence in Gaza and Gazans' suffering are conveyed to outsiders either through the IDF spokesperson office or through the intimate everyday documentation and broadcasting carried out by Palestinian reporters and citizen reporters who managed to survive the carnage, amongst them children. I don't know. Those of you who are following things on TikTok know what children I'm talking about. So they document every bit of misery. I'm actually gonna skip the graphic descriptions here. But these images and videos that are available to a terrifying degree are shocking and sensational. Or at least it stands to reason that they should be, that they should shake us to our core. So to put it in context by way of historical comparison, it is worth noting that in the past, reports on French torture in Algeria, like images from the Vietnam War, have had considerable impact on public opinion in the imperial center. Even if they did not single-handedly stop those atrocities, there was some impact. So what I'm asking today is basically how and why current reports are not so shocking to most, not to most Israelis as this war just continues, and not to most of the Western world, including the US, that continues to fund this war. So put simply, my main question is, how is it possible that so many people do not see Gaza in both the literal sense of seeing and the more metaphorical, kind of deeper sense? One way of explaining this indifference is to claim that it stems from our distance from the reported events. A similar explanation would find the cause in a supposed lack of exposure due to the siloing off nature of social media and its now infamous algorithmic echo chambers. Such explanations, however, can only go so far. After 18 months of hellfire, no exposure to Palestinian death and suffering is nearly impossible. It is all but the result of active avoidance or denial of something that itself needs to be explained and therefore cannot serve as an explanation. So this is a classic case of begging the question in the original sense, right? Of assuming that which needs to be explained. So if I'm saying it's because of distance or because people are not seeing, I want to know why. Why is there such distance? Similarly, explanations that hinge on racist indifference or on desensitization, sorry, it's a word I cannot possibly say, suffer from the same problem. They do not explain why or how such racist indifference or desensitization came into being. And so they beg the question. So I'm begging you to basically think about this question. I'm going to attempt a partial explanation, and I can talk about other parts of the explanation in the Q&A if there's any interest. Addressing Hamas's October 7th attack, media conversations have often framed the event as demonstrating an Israeli failure of intelligence. But all the information was in fact readily available, and now we know that for a fact. It was rather a much deeper failure, a very kind of, I call it a failure of the imagination, and of here is working in a Derridian sense, sorry. It's not that the imagination fails, It's a failure produced by the imagination. It takes a lot of imagination, a lot of active work to not see, to not be aware of what is happening. Okay, so the overwhelming majority of Jewish Israelis have been living their lives as though Palestinians are not only destined to disappear, but have somehow already disappeared. And this is a bit enigmatic, and I hope that very soon it will become clearer. The post-Oslo regime of conflict management maintained the status quo, allowing Jewish Israelis to live and see and think in this future anterior of the will have been gone, in some time to come in which Palestinians have already disappeared, in which they have been solved, as the conflict resolution is looking for this solution that is forever deferred. This blindness is partly the result of growing Israeli reliance on automated technologies for managing conflict. So you might be aware of all those surveillance, biometric, and algorithmic technologies that reduce Palestinians to objective data points and increase the distance between Israeli security personnel and the Palestinians that they subjugate. But this blindness is not as new as this technology. It actually goes back quite a long time. It has a much longer history. Israelis have been regarding Palestinians as disappeared or disregarding them since the very beginning. Elias Sanbar, a Palestinian author and scholar, put it really well in an interview with Gilles Deleuze, by the way. This is very random. So this is a quote. In 1948, our country was not merely occupied, but was somehow disappeared. That's certainly the way that the Jewish settlers, who at that moment became Israelis, had to live the thing. In order for this disappearance to succeed, it had to function from the start as if it had already taken place, which is to say, by never seeing the existence of the other who was indisputably present all the same. End quote. This disregard for Palestinians is thus not simply the result of no exposure or ignorance on the part of Jewish Israelis, as was the assumption of so many 1990s NGOs that made it their mission to document and publicize Israeli crimes, past and present. As Sanbar argued, the blindness of the Israeli community to Palestinians with whom it, this is a quote from Sanbar, physically rubbed shoulders, was not physical. No one was deceived in the slightest degree. It was based rather, and still quote, in an evacuation of the other from the settlers' own heads, in a view of Palestinians as being on the verge of disappearance. End quote. That is, Zionists were aware that Palestinians were there. They were aware of the violence that they're themselves committing against Palestinians, but they were ignoring both facts by living in some future time in which Palestinians will have had already disappeared. This disappearance is not so much a lie, which would assume knowledge of that which is hidden. It is rather the ability to excuse oneself from wrought engagement, a refusal to witness that Anne-Laura Stoller calls, quote, the well-tended conditions of disregard, end quote. What disappears is not merely the facts, but their political, ethical, social, economic, and cultural meanings, or their representations. Thus, despite some growing Israeli awareness of the fact of the Nakba, blindness to its implications persists. Recently, I've been arguing that this disregard requires the arduous ideological work of what I call the repression of the repression. Those elaborate psychological and cultural mechanisms that allow Jewish Israelis to claim that they are fully aware of the oppression of Palestinians while repressing both this oppression and their repression of it. The very fact that they do not know or do not wish to know what is taking place in their names. This repression of the repression is tied to a deep and contradictory Israeli desire. This all sounds very abstract, but I'm soon going to demonstrate that with the literature. So there's one desire is the desire that Palestinians will finally disappear. And then there is a related desire that this disappearance will not be caused by our own hands, is basically the language. So think about all the current talk of voluntary emigration out of Gaza. This paradoxical desire is perhaps best reflected in our current Israeli fantasy of a button that would make Palestinians vanish. This is, again, everywhere in public discourse. So in August 2024, for instance, an episode of the English language podcast, Two Nice Jewish Boys, has gone viral when its Israeli co-hosts joked about their desire, which they ascribe to the majority of Israelis, to wipe out every single Palestinian with the push of a button. Similarly, in June 2022, Matan Kahana, then the Israeli Deputy Minister of Religious Affairs and currently a member of Knesset representing a center party, publicly fantasized of a button that would make all the Arabs disappear, sending them, quotation, on an express train to Switzerland so that they live an amazing, amazing lives there. The end of a quotation. And this too might resonate with you in all kinds of contemporary ways. There are numerous cultural representations of this core paradoxical desire. And I want to talk today about Palestinian representations of that paradoxical desire. The novel, The Book of Disappearance, by the Palestinian author Ibtissam Azem, truly gets at the core of the paradox. In its magical realist style, this work of speculative fiction depicts a world in which all Palestinians everywhere have suddenly vanished. In Azem's novel, as in the button fantasy, the extreme, exceptional case, the complete elimination of a native population emerges as the implicit telos of Zionism. And disappearance is presented no longer as a mere side effect of Zionist state building or of colonial wars, but rather as its organizing core principle. And, in a sense, even if this principle is just aspired to asymptotically, even if it's not achieved, it's still there as a principle. The Book of Disappearance also addresses the Israeli justificatory system behind this disappearance fantasy and the moral psychology it involves. So, a right-wing Jewish Israeli character in the novel expresses joy at this occurrence, claiming that this is a divine miracle and that Israel should celebrate that this problem disappeared on its own, while a leftist character cynically describes this disappearance event as the cleanest campaign of ethnic cleansing witnessed by humanity. The Jewish Israeli protagonist of the novel obsessively insists that the IDF had nothing to do with this disappearance, which happened, quote, without a drop of blood, end quote, while his mother rushes off to capitalize on Palestinian real estate, supposedly left behind. So I want to dig just a bit deeper into this novel. The plot of the Book of Disappearance unfolds mainly through the voices of two narrators. There's Ariel, a Jewish Israeli journalist attempting to single-handedly solve the mystery of the Palestinian disappearance, and specifically the disappearance of his friend Allah. And then there's Allah himself, a Palestinian, a cameraman, whose voice emerges in the novel only through his journal entries, which Ariel finds in his vacated apartment and reads in the narrative present. The journal also features the memories of Allah's grandmother, which depict Jaffa before, during, and after its 1948 colonization. So the Book of Disappearance, by doing all of that, addresses Palestinian disappearance on multiple levels. First, the fantastic disappearance in the present resonates with the very real mass expulsion of 1948 and other modes of ethnic cleansing before and after 1948. Azem often layers the fictive contemporary disappearance with familiar tropes from accounts of 1948, chairs left next to meals not yet eaten, the aroma of coffee still hanging in the air. By framing the fictional Palestinian disappearance as an echo or repetition of the Nakba, Azem presents this colonial disappearance as ongoing, as unfurling in a longer history of massacres, displacements, juridical exclusion, appropriation, ghettoization, and so on. Second, in her insistence on the Palestinian cartography of Greater Jaffa, which Israel has attempted to efface, Azem documents not only this epistemic erasure itself, but also traces of resistance and the generational continuities they sustain. So Allah writes in his diary addressing his grandmother, I was certain that your city, the one you kept talking about, has nothing to do with my city. The names, the orange groves, scents, Al-Hamra Cinema, Prophet Rubin's Feast, Iskandar Awad Street, Al-Nusha Street, Sa'a Square, etc. Where do all these names come from? Names not written on signs. End quote. So this sort of epistemic erasure is what we saw earlier today in Professor Damrash's presentation yesterday. We're looking at the erasure of Arabic place names, in Azem's case, names of streets, and their replacement by Hebrew names, sometimes ones that celebrate Zionism, and at other times, ones that are homophones of the original Arabic name. And that way they are lending the Hebrew place names an air of indigeneity. The erasure of Arabic from the Israeli public space is also evident in the revocation of the status of Arabic as an official state language, which happened in 2018 with the nation state law. Third, the novel reveals the status of Palestinians as an often invisible captive market and workforce. And I'm not going to get into that today, but I'm just going to mention it. And then finally, and fourth, Azam's novel also highlights some of the racializing aspects of this process of disappearance for both Palestinians and Mizrahi Jew. So she mentions, for instance, kind of a traumatic case of disappearance of children of Yemeni Jews that happened in the late 1940s, early 1950s. So the word disappearance is again there, but by kind of invoking that memory, she's showing this co-constitutive racialization process that is happening there, that creates a structural competition between the two groups and that erase both their cultures, but in a different way. So in the case of Palestinians, it segregates Palestinians as others under the generic cultural label Arabs, not allowing them to appear as Palestinians with their national history and national culture. In the case of Mizrahim, it is precisely their Arab cultures that it erases, instead of homogenizing those cultures under the term Mizrahi, which is a term made in Israel. Azam's novel is not an outlier. In fact, Palestinian literature is absolutely rife with disappearances. The very word disappearance, or ikhtifa in Arabic, appears in the titles of so many notable Palestinian works, from Emil Habibi's formative novel, The Strange Circumstances of the Disappearance of Said, the Ill-Fated Optimist. This is a translation of the original Arabic title. The English title doesn't have the disappearance in there, but trust me, it's there. To Elias Suleiman's film, Sijil Ikhtifa, Chronicle of Disappearance, to Syed Kashua's short story, Herzl Disappears at Midnight. Beyond title, disappearances are ubiquitous in the narrative machinery of numerous Palestinian novels and form the very motor of the work. Spinning a black hole around which both narrative and action are plotted, disappearances serve as the condition of possibility for both. Azam's novel joins a long line of works, beginning with Habibi's Optimist and continuing with Jabra Ibrahim Jabra's In Search of Walid Mas'ud, Ibrahim Nasrallah's Prairies of Fever, Anton Shamas, whom I mentioned today, and his novel Arabesques, and more recently, Ahmed Mas'ud's Vanished. In all of these, the disappearance of a central protagonist sets in motion both the main action of the novel and investigation of the circumstances of disappearance and its retelling. Disappearance also figures prominently in Palestinian poetry, and we've talked about Mahmoud Darwish today. So, In the Presence of Absence is a very famous poem and collection, which describes his family's struggle to return to their village, Abirwe, only to find it nearly erased. Given this scale and explicitness of such historical erasure, it is no wonder that disappearance figures so prominently in Palestinian literary reckonings with 1948 and its ongoing forms. What is surprising is its persistence, pervasiveness, and elasticity as a conceptual trope in depicting contemporary colonial conditions. In a sense, disappearance is the poetic name given by Palestinian writers to various processes of Zionist elimination, segregated exploitation, overlooking, and racialization. So in my, everyone mentioned their books, so now I feel compelled to do it. So in my first and only book, I dedicate a chapter to disappearance, and I try to sort out the different meanings of disappearance in Palestinian literature and to tease out their formal possibilities and political implication. And I read that as an alternative conceptual schema, as a way of thinking about what it is to be a Palestinian in Israel and in the West Bank and Gaza. Actually kind of crosses the Green Line, but also to think about anti-colonial forms of resistance that happen in those same novels through formal disappearance. I'll stop here. Thank you so much.
Honestly, what an honor, to be at the end of such a wonderful series of presentations and discussions and talks. And I too also want to take a moment to thank Scott, Beth, and of course Robert as well, who I feel like has been slightly neglected in the series of thanks. But thank you all very much. And I also want to echo and thank Liron as well. Not necessarily going off script, but in the light of genocide in Gaza, it's been very difficult to find the time and headspace to even talk about things in the constructed manner that I would wish to have presented this paper. But I'm also thankful for Liron for contextualizing a lot of what I'll be talking about today, because I really do want to try to jump as quickly as possible into the literature and into the poetry, but at the same time bogged down by the relentless onslaught of news updates and casualties and maiming and deaths, killings. And one more thank you, because I was thinking of what is the thread really in one sentence that what I'm talking about today in my presentation, and it is the risk of disappearance of Palestine and Palestinian into the English language. I want to find a language. I want to find a language that transforms language itself into steel for the spirit. A language to use against these sparkling silver insects, these jets. I want to sing. I want a language that I can lean on and that can lean on me, that asks me to bear witness and that I can ask to bear witness to what power there is in us to overcome this cosmic isolation. So this is a quote from Mahmoud Darwish's Memory for Forgetfulness, which is a novel-length prose poem, actually, spans over 100 pages, which documents and discusses the Palestinian experience during the 1982 Israeli invasion of Beirut and the siege of Beirut at the time. So it chronicles the events that take place on August 6th, specifically, which is the anniversary of Hiroshima Day. And as the quote that I read suggests, is really an indictment against language's inability to bear witness and to resist human atrocities. I wish I could go into details of the events of the novel and how Mahmoud Darwish very masterfully uses this collapsing of time and space to talk about everything ranging from Israeli military shutting off water from Beirut and the history of the Mediterranean Sea, and also using Hiroshima Day as a way to kind of read the advancements of military technology the Israeli military used to bomb Beirut, specifically the vacuum bomb and the devastation that it does. But really, when I talk about Memory for Forgetfulness, sometimes just as important is its publication and translation history and the story behind that. So we know that in 1982, around August 26, Mahmoud Darwish leaves Beirut with the PLO, who are pretty much sent out this exodus into Tunisia, to Tunis. Mahmoud Darwish doesn't stay there for very long, eventually makes his way to Paris, where it's said that he locks himself up in his hotel room for 5 days, consecutive days, does not leave until he produces Memory for Forgetfulness, sends it off to his publisher at al-khatt, never looks at it again, essentially. And I usually used to talk about this anecdote because it tells us a little bit about the relationship between literature and trauma, being able to put into language through script, the ability to articulate the inarticulatable or the unspeakable, the unthinkable, so on and so forth. But really, it tells us another story, and it tells us a story about translation and also the movement of languages across script worlds through the act of translation, specifically, and I'm thinking here in Arabic to English, because of course it was written in Arabic first. But it took 10 years for this text to be translated into English in 1995. And this points to the crisis of translation as a bridge across script worlds and its limitations, if you will. I mean, in just one phrase, it takes too long. The catastrophe has already happened. It's in the distant past. It's been chilled. It's cooled down. It's irrelevant. So I think around 2015, a phenomena surges amongst Palestinian writers and Palestinians specifically in Gaza in 2015 to begin to write in English, this imperative that emerges. And it can be traced back to the outcome at the end of the 2014 Gaza war, which the United Nations says that 2,251 Palestinians, among which 1,462 civilians were killed by the Israeli military, not to mention casualties and deaths and destruction of property and so on and so forth. And really, it's almost safe to say that Rifat al-Harir was a major proponent of this imperative to begin publishing and writing in English. He himself was a poet, but also an English professor, an expert in Shakespeare, if you will. And he taught at the Islamic University of Gaza, which is now a heap of rubble, along with the rest of the universities and schools in Gaza at the moment. But really, it is because of this poem that I believe the Western world really knows who Rifat al-Harir is, which circulated immediately after his death and was read across internetscapes, in spaces, poetry readings, so on and so forth, maybe the most popular of which belonging to Brian Dennis Cox, who is a Scottish Shakespeareanist, if you will, but really known for his drama, his films, his cinema. He's an actor in films and television, and he performs this reading, and it stuns the world. But of course, Rifat did not write it in 2023. He wrote it in 2011, anticipating his death on a certain level. Of course, he survived many sieges and blockades and assaults in Gaza. Fortunately, he eventually succumbed in 2023, December 6, when he was killed along with his family in his home. Yusuf al-Jamal, one of Rifat's students, says the following. Rifat thought, quote, Rifat thought that speaking to the world in English will help us to tell our story and convey the Palestinian side of the story. That is why he invested in English. So he used English as a tool of resistance, not because he thought that English was superior to Arabic. In fact, he believed the opposite. He thought that Arabic had more metaphors, and he quoted Edward Said that it was the language of love and philosophy and politics. So it's because Rifat had a pen to tell the story of Palestine that the story of Gaza could reach a wider audience. And I think he was successful in doing that, end quote. So initially I thought this slide was going to be important, but I think Liron helped set this up, that the threat of Palestinian erasure on the level of script to go as far as to suggest that Palestine does not exist because there's no P in the Arabic language, points to obviously the absurdity in that claim that Palestine is not referred to as Palestine in Arabic, but Palestine with a fa. And just pointing to some kind of historical evidence, this is Marjam al-Buldan, composed in the 13th century, and we see entries ranging from Palestine to Gaza to Rafah even, and so on and so forth. So this is just a demonstration to say the degree to which Palestine, as a poetic motif, as a potential dream state or homeland, is not safe in the English language. It treads that space with a lot of risk to its existence within that realm of the English language. So we heard a little bit about Musab Abu Taha today, who was also a student of Rifat and a close friend of his, who is one of the students who responds to Rifat's calls, and as he begins to write poetry in English on the internet, on Facebook, in 2014. He's also known for founding two of the first English language libraries in Gaza, the first one in 2017 and the second one in 2019 in Gaza City. Both of those don't exist anymore. But it really wasn't until after 2023 that his first publication of poetry really begins to receive critical acclaim. And more so, especially after he published his piece in the New Yorker, after he was released from being kidnapped and beaten by the IDF in Gaza. Don't have much time, but I'm going to read a little bit of his poetry, and I want some things to just be inferred, really. To my visa interviewer, which one of me do you plan to interview? I am many, some I don't even know. Need you interview my clothes, books, toothpaste, comb, my baby son's diapers and napkins, the food not yet digested in my belly? It will find its way out before I get my visa. Without completing the poem, we get a sense that one of the topics that Musab Butoha talks about in his poetry is kind of the minutiae and the mundane and the everyday experience of being Palestinian in Gaza. Now, Musab is indeed an important voice. His voice is important because he is a Palestinian who not only bore witness to genocide, but he escaped it. And that's critical. But today I have to ask the really difficult question as a literary scholar. How do the literary institutions that prop up the success and visibility of one poet from Gaza potentially silence and erase other poetic voices that might be more urgent? And this is not an easy claim to make by any means, but I'm asking that what happens to Arabic poetry in English and to the poetic tradition under the violence of occupation and in the time of genocide, when Palestine as a homeland, a cause, a poetic motif, crosses over script worlds from Arabic into English. It's in interviews that we learn that Musab uses poetry to process events, to report and spread awareness. But what does it mean when his poetry only goes as far as self-reflection? What happens when poetry from Palestine becomes subject to the banality of reportage that Mahmoud Darwish was so terrified of in Memory for Forgetfulness? What is the difference then between a poem and a tweet? What happens also when institutions like PEN America, the New Yorker, and New York Times prop up poets like Musab for publicity, but refuse to issue statements that recognize genocide, which he does in his poetry? Ahmed al-Mallah, who was born in Bethlehem, Palestine, spent the majority of his life, his adult life, in the United States. And he prefers to use the term poet from Palestine over Palestinian poet, predicating the identity as a poet first. He composes in English. He used to compose in Arabic, but he abandons that language as it no longer sustains him in his world and in life in Indiana and Pennsylvania and New York, so on and so forth. But he does offer us a model when poets write across script worlds. And here in his poetry, Palestine and the Arabic poetic tradition continue to echo in the background, despite it being composed in English. From his volumes, Bitter English to Wrong Winds, there is also processing that's undeniable. His mother's battle with Alzheimer's, him developing a new poetic language as his mother loses the ability to speak, the excruciating relationship to English, being Palestinian in America, and now genocide. So take, for example, one poem from Wrong Winds, Because You Wished It. And because you is the object of love, you, yes, you, my enemy, into whose enmity I was born. You are my always, and I am the never you tried to master. You who knows well how to feed my world destruction. The cryptic dance between the dichotomy of subject and object, self and other, I and you, recreates the dialogues of us versus them that plays out in one's mind, politics, and the media. However, as the poem suggests, these are unstable categories, as you is both the object of love and the object of hate. Like in Ilarir's If I Must Die, Then You Must Live, the address of you draws us in as we explore the range of emotions that emerge between the discursive relationship of self and other, and how language feeds destruction to the subject's world. But it isn't until we reach the end of this poem that we discover the context of this dichotomy and perhaps its motive. You thought it enough to burn me. You thought it enough to burn me, danced like a devil over my remains. In the open, you thought I'd shrivel and die in the eye of the desert sun. You thought you have annihilated me, erased my identity, my history, my everything. But in vain, all your efforts, in vain you will remain, because a rebel doesn't wither, a rebel doesn't settle, a rebel is me. At the end, I say, I'll come for you one day. I'm coming for you one day. So embedded in the poem is the voice of Maria Hanoun, a 4-year-old girl from Gaza and a survivor of Israel's genocide. She had just returned to her home in North Gaza after the ceasefire announced on January 19th, 2025. This video of Maria went viral on social media. She stands in the back seat of her parents' car, reciting verses composed by the Saudi poet Muhaddil al-Sukur.
أنك بعدما أحرقتني ورقصتك الشيطان فوق أنفاسي وتركتني للذاريات تنظرني طفلا لعين الشمس في الفلاوات أتظن أنك عقدت مستقبليتي ومحوت تاريخ ومعتقداتي عبثا تحاول لا ثناء لي أنا كالقيامة ذات يوم آتي أنا كالقيامة ذات يوم آتي.
By including Maria, al-Malah's poem becomes more than a space where Arabic poetry lives in English. It becomes a portal of translation, one that brings both as-Sukur and Maria closer to English-speaking audiences. Most will never heard of as-Sukur, and even those in the West whose algorithms have tuned in to the live stream genocide likely won't have any context other than a scene of a young girl in a stance of defiance. In fact, even many Arabic-speaking audiences are left wondering, how could a 4-year-old girl produce such a sophisticated recitation of traditional verse? So this is not a translation, but a rewriting of Maria's recitation of the poem. And al-Malah responsibly attributes it to her in a footnote. So one cannot help but wonder if the pronouns, the yous and the I's, are the same for al-Malah and Maria. What is certain is that Maria's recitation becomes the key that unlocks the conversation between the poet and himself and Maria, Maria and her defiance against her own annihilation, and the Arabic poetic tradition's deep roots in resistance and defiance. So I want to conclude with one last poem by al-Malah, one that demonstrates poetry's ability to anticipate, if not prophesize, especially when it is not only self-aware and self-reflective, but when it attempts to remain tethered to the legacy of its own tradition. Not necessarily tradition limited to the ancient Arab past or the more recent tradition of the 20th century modernist movement, but rather the tradition of poetry's materiality, its relationship to books not as an idea, but as objects or raw materials that have already been manipulated to preserve language and memory, making it an official object worthy of accolades and institutional prestige. Wook. When the world ends, as in the now, we'll have to turn to books, return books to their source, and use them as burning wood. For now, I look at my stack of scrapbooks, mostly wood on wood. It doesn't burn on its own. What will I part with first to keep warm? Or cook myself something? Because you can't eat a book, not for sustenance anyway. Or could I make a structure out of all my books? What would wood look like in that form? Would the words stick out facing the sky? Or would they be dripping in on my head, on everything? I don't know how to save myself anyhow, most of the time. I don't know mainly how to save myself from my words. I would want them all alive and well, or at once, all at once, burning.
نحن اليوم مجبرون في قطاع غزة بعد أن استخرجنا ديوان الشعر هذا من تحت الردم مجبرون أن نحرق أشعارنا وتاريخنا وأدبنا وحضارتنا وإنسانيتنا في النار كي نطهي طعامنا كي نطهي خبزنا مجبرون على ذلك ونحن نعيش حرب الإبادة التي يشنها العدو الإسرائيلي. أنا حزين وأنا أحرق ديوان شعر نازك الملائكة وأعتذر للشعراء والكتاب والأدباء والقراء وأعتذر للأمة العربية كلها التي خذلتنا وقصرت عن حمايتنا وقصرت عن توفير شربة ماء أو رغيف خبز أو جرعة نار نطهو بها طعامنا. شكرا لأمتنا العربية سنحرق أشعارنا والسلام عليكم.
So judging from the sound of the drone noise in the background, that runs perpetually in Gaza. I don't think there's anything very necessarily performative about this piece. Not to mention that Faiz Abu Shamali is a fellow academic who's burning his collection of modernist poetry to fuel the stove for cooking. So it was only a few months before this video that Al-Malah's poem presages genocide's material destruction of Arabic poetry in Gaza, where literature, culture, and tradition must resort to their primordial forms: fuel to cook food, lumber to build a roof. In a genocide, literature must sustain the self in more immediate ways. Occupation and genocide also threaten the tradition of Arabic poetry when it distorts what should be included and what should be reserved for a different medium. Poetry under occupation also means the deterioration of the space for poetic criticism, when it is either being muffled by the scream in the face of oppression, or when complicit institutions perpetuate the violence of occupation and ethnic cleansing by celebrating poets that are digestible for those audiences. And I'm reminded here in Cindy Texter's discussion on Kim Saryang. While it may seem callous to discuss poetics and aesthetics when unimaginable terror is being unleashed against the Palestinians as we speak, the work of literary studies has an important part to play. So as I struggle to find the words, I'll wrap up with a verse by someone who was able to say it all in a single breath and in two scripts. وَالشَّعْرُ وَهُوَ كَذَلِكَ يُقْتَلْ فِي الْمَجَازِرِ. Some of what passes as poetry in the moment of genocide serves those in empire who seek validation and credit for their emotions and guilt. This so-called poetry will return to haunt us all and will be remembered as another form of violence. Thank you.